Good morning, everybody. Welcome to New York Law School. I'm Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to our City Law Breakfast. These breakfasts are sponsored by Con Edison, Verizon, the Greenberg Traurig Law Firm, and the Murray Goodgold Foundation. We're very grateful to them for the support which allows us to have these breakfasts at no charge and open to the public. We are delighted this morning to have Sheldon Silver here, Speaker of the New York State Assembly. He is in January when the Assembly meets. He will be in his 30th year as a member of the State Assembly and his 16th year as Speaker. He was born on the Lower East Side, attended Yeshiva, or graduated from Yeshiva University and Brooklyn Law School. He's a lawyer. He was a law secretary to Civil Court Judge Francis Pecora. First elected to the Assembly in 1976 and has been identified with many important legislative topics affecting New York City: rent control, housing, tax issues, education, budget reform, and as to the latter, litigated to the Court of Appeals one of the most important governmental cases in decades, Silver versus Pataki, a case that decided the relationship of the legislature to the governor under the state constitution, which, at least probably in the Speaker's view, gives too much power to the governor. The Court of Appeals thought otherwise. But we are delighted to have him here to speak to those issues and any other issues about the legislative session. We welcome Sheldon Silver.
Thank you, Professor Sandler, for that kind and very generous introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the warm reception. It is an honor to be here at New York Law School, one of Lower Manhattan's treasures and one of our most valued institutions. As an attorney, I have an affinity for the places where the study of law and the pursuit of a truer, more visionary justice transcends scholarship and rises to the level of passion. There is nothing I enjoy more than a vigorous debate over issues, particularly the issues that so deeply impact our families, our homes, and our communities. Education, healthcare, jobs, criminal justice, and the civil liberties that are the foundation of our democratic society. I have long admired New York Law School's involvement in those debates, and especially the commitment to innovation and integrity. I'm grateful that there is a nonpartisan entity in this city, right here in my hometown of Lower Manhattan, that's dedicated to making government more efficient, more productive, and certainly more easily understood. It is a privilege to have my name added to the honor roll of noteworthy leaders whose words still echo through the hallowed halls of this great law school. Let me add that this institution is fortunate to count among its faculty Professor Ross Sandler. Someone whose leadership, his commitment to excellence in public service has engendered the respect of this city's leaders and all who strive to maintain New York's status as the greatest metropolis in the world. My topic assigned to me this morning, because I'd love to talk about other things, but issues in the upcoming legislative session. And rather than read to you from a long list of prominent issues, let me again, in the spirit of debate, begin by asking you a few questions. What is our nation's, our state's, and our city's obligation to Lower Manhattan post-September 11th, 2001? Is anyone inspired by the progress of the rebuilding and revitalization effort so far. I tell you bluntly, without apology, that my hometown, the battlefield that absorbed the brunt of bin Laden's war on America, is not recovering as it should, as it must, as true American honor would dictate. More than 4 years have passed, closer to 4.5 years, and the downtown economy continues to stagnate. Last year, when I addressed this city's business leaders on this issue in April, I told them point blank that we lacked and desperately needed a comprehensive plan for rebuilding and revitalizing Lower Manhattan. I reminded them that prior to the attacks, downtown was the third largest business district in the nation. Now we're number 4 and threatening to slip further behind. Remember, Lower Manhattan is still short 67,000 jobs. That's 67,000 diners who aren't dining in the restaurants downtown. It's 67,000 shoppers who aren't shopping in our shops. It's 67,000 customers who aren't banking in the banks downtown. In an attempt to jumpstart the planning effort, I offered the city's business leaders a Marshall Plan of my own, a plan composed of incentives and building projects intended to renew Lower Manhattan's legendary business prowess. I said that we must convince more mega corporations, mid-sized firms, small firms, financial houses to relocate here in downtown. I said that we must erect more commercial space and retail stores, more research facilities, more schools, libraries, and community centers. This is a historic community, and it should be a thriving 24-hour-a-day community. The fact is that over 1/3 of the people who live in my assembly district walk to work. There is no other place like that anywhere. To that end, I have worked with Goldman Sachs and with Verizon to move and consolidate their operations here in Lower Manhattan. I propose that the Port Authority build a new headquarters on the World Trade Center site. I even offered to move my office and challenge the governor and other elected officials to move theirs to a new building at ground zero. Of course, none of this can happen until the Port Authority repairs the foundation, the slurry walls that are necessary to do any further building. Additionally, I joined the mayor in announcing the creation of a new elementary school not far from here on the site of the downtown hospital parking lot at this point. We proposed the construction of the Church Street retail corridor, and the mayor is now on board on that. Yet, there is delay after delay, and with each one, Lower Manhattan continues to lose ground. I want you to understand that Lower Manhattan is what I tell all of my colleagues in the Assembly is my hometown. Its future is more than a governmental issue to me. It's personal to me, and I will not abide any effort to make Lower Manhattan anything less than the financial and business capital of the world as it's always been. Lower Manhattan needs our federal, our state, and our city governments to recognize that our recovery is priority number one for this city and state. We need effective and consistent leadership. We cannot continue to endure the starts and stops that we've had. We must get the ball rolling and keep it rolling. 5 generations of Silvers, from my grandparents to my grandchildren, have lived in Lower Manhattan and continue to call it home today. It's not too much to ask, but I'd like to know that 50 years from now, there will be Silvers still calling Lower Manhattan home, because together we did the hard work and we built a better Lower Manhattan than any previous generations had ever known. Next year, 2006, will be the governor's last year as governor. We'll be working with him, with our colleagues in the Senate, on this Lower Manhattan issue. We must rebuild and revitalize our community. In the same vein, moving on to perhaps a more familiar topic to a lot of people, let me say that hopefully, with the cooperation of the governor in his last year as governor and with our colleagues in the Senate, we can pass a second consecutive on-time budget and address this state's needs. We'll also be setting the agenda for the next governor of this state, who I hope and I expect will be our current Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer. We'll be preparing for a future where the school funding issue is settled once and for all. We will be preparing for a future where New York's economic development and job creation effort, it will be understood that that begins in the classrooms of our city and state and extends into every kind of high-tech research and development and takes into account each community's competitive advantages and assets. We'll be preparing for a future that abhors the culture of corruption and demands transparency, integrity, and accountability at every level of government. We'll be preparing for a future where the health, education, and welfare of the people are considered the moral obligation of government and not merely the fodder for speeches. When it comes to jobs, the Assembly majority that I'm proud to lead will continue investing in regional economic development. We'll continue to employ our outstanding state and city universities, our colleges, our community colleges, as hubs for high-tech research and development, for business incubation, for workforce training, and for modernizing our manufacturing sector. We'll continue to recommend limited, targeted tax cuts and to take action to help small business survive and to flourish in the state of New York. And we'll continue to advocate for low-cost energy for business growth as well as relief from home heating costs. The Assembly majority approaches the next legislative session as the undisputed leaders of education reform. Our leadership has brought about higher standards, greater accountability from our local schools to the Board of Regents, improved school governance here in the city, and so much more. Without question, the state must once and for all resolve the Campaign for Fiscal Equity decision. Thank you, Councilman. One of the plaintiffs in that case. With a solution that will not take resources away from any school district. It is probably the most important issue that we can face coming up. And sadly, the current governor has never truly addressed the school funding issue. And he will be more likely to try to push it on to the next governor without addressing it next year. He should be embarrassed by the number of students that have been shortchanged, denied the resources that they need to fulfill their dreams and to compete in the global marketplace. We must not shortchange another generation of students. 10 years of appeals is long enough. As pleased as we all are that the city has resolved its long-running contract dispute with its teachers, the truth is there is still a tremendous disparity between compensation at urban, suburban, and rural teachers, and we should address that disparity. Consider this. The high school class of 2018 is sitting in our kindergartens right now as we speak. They don't realize it, but they are already competing with their counterparts from Asia, from the European Commonwealth, from India, and also with the 5-year-olds from every city, town, and village in North America. I believe that we have a moral obligation to provide all of our children with a sound, basic education at the very least. With this as our standard, you can be sure that we will continue our fight in 2006 to fully fund universal pre-K throughout this state, to further reduce class size, to ensure that every school and every classroom is structurally safe, environmentally healthy, and stocked with up-to-date learning resources. Students should not be doomed to learn math by counting the raindrops that leak through the schoolhouse ceiling, or counting the paint chips that come off the wall of the schools that they sit in. We will support continuing professional development for our teachers as well as ever vital after-school programs for all of its students. I'm confident that our next governor will recognize something that our current governor could not, that our human capital is our greatest comparative advantage when competing in this global economy. And therefore, we must prepare our future by strengthening our higher education system as well. It's time to say no more cuts to TAP, no more cuts to Bundy Aid, no more cuts to opportunity programs, no more cuts to community colleges, and no more shutting the doors of our colleges and universities to those who are most in need, but can least afford the dream of a higher education in this state. Moving on to other areas, it is estimated that 2.8 million New Yorkers, or roughly 15% of our population, is without health insurance. In an effort to provide coverage to more working families and children, The Assembly majority created the Family Health Plus, and we expanded coverage on the Child Health Plus program. Let me remind you what that program is. It's the one that the governor spends hundreds of thousands of dollars to advertise on television while he proposes to cut the program in order to save the money to pay for the commercials. We believe that health care, like education, is a moral obligation of this state. So we will continue our efforts to provide coverage to as many uninsured New Yorkers as is possible, guaranteeing that affordable, accessible, quality health care is available to all New Yorkers. This demands that we address the fiscal crisis that is facing so many of the hospitals in this state today. The Healthcare Association of New York State is reporting that New York hospitals lost $127 million in the year 2004, the 7th consecutive year that they have lost money. The legislature and the governor have established an 18-member commission on health care facilities in the 21st century. The job is to remedy this perennial problem and to assist us in right-sizing New York's vast health care system. With respect to Medicaid, let me reiterate that Medicaid cuts do not constitute Medicaid reform, because the program exists to provide care to vulnerable communities. Our Assembly majority is intent on ensuring that the Medicaid dollars are being administered carefully and expended wisely. In fact, we have been hosting public hearings across this state to examine how this state can more successfully combat Medicaid fraud. Fraud, however, is only part of the problem facing this state. Understand that a small percentage of the population accounts for the bulk of Medicaid expenditures. The aged, the blind, and the physically challenged account for 72% of Medicaid expenditures, yet they comprise only 1/3 of all Medicaid recipients. The small group of New Yorkers are primary users of costly long-term care services. Going back to 1994, the Assembly has advanced measures intended to lift the high cost of Medicaid from taxpayers without compromising the quality of health care services. If the governor had followed our lead, localities would have saved hundreds of millions of dollars from the requirement of taxing their local populations through real property taxes in order to make those payments. Along with fraud and expense, keep in mind that the state is still not receiving its fair share from Washington when it comes to Medicaid dollars. For some states, the federal government reimburses 75% of their Medicaid costs. New York receives 50%. Some people might think we are one of the wealthy industrial states. Well, let me propose to you that some of our colleagues in the Northeast, like Pennsylvania at 53%, Michigan at 57%, Ohio at 59%, and surprisingly, Texas, with all its oil wealth, is reimbursed to the tune of 60%. If the governor could pick up the phone and have his friend and classmate in the White House, just provide us with another 5%, just 5%, that would mean $3 billion in additional federal Medicaid reimbursement. Imagine what $3 billion can do as far as providing health care, as far as providing property tax relief to taxpayers across the state of New York. $3 billion more in federal reimbursement would go a long way in this state. Obviously, another critical issue in the 2006 legislative session will be criminal justice. From my first day in public office and throughout my tenure as Speaker of the New York State Assembly, I have advocated for this state to be as tough on constitutionally permissible on crime. Since I've been Speaker, the Assembly majority has passed, the Governor has signed more than 100 new tough on crime laws in New York State. The Governor of this state has acknowledged that, and now he is saying that as a result of those actions, New York is the safest big state in the nation. And the mayor of this city says that New York City is the safest big city in the nation. These days, much is being written and reported about sexual predators and the issue of civil confinement. Let me make it very clear. As a father, a grandfather, and a law-abiding citizen, I despise all who prey upon women and children, the aged, the physically challenged, the mentally ill, and the poor. There is nothing I want more than to keep our children safe and to keep dangerous sexual predators out of every city, town, and village and neighborhood in this state. As a student of the law, as a practicing attorney, I also know the boundaries of our legal system. And I know that you can't strengthen those boundaries with knee-jerk reactions and political game playing. The New York Court of Appeals declaration that the governor's death penalty law was unconstitutional proves that point. A recent decision by a trial court finding that the administration had failed to follow a number of simple legal requirements in seeking to confine 12 sexual predators also proves that point. The appearance of toughness may work in the wild, but it is not enough to shield our loved ones and our communities from violent crimes. While I recognize that personal attacks being directed at me are the last gasp of a political party and a political leader that is wrestling with failure and irrelevance here in New York. The spewing of such venom and the subsequent frightening and riling of our citizens will not protect vulnerable New Yorkers from the predators that are within our midst. I ask you, what good are tough laws if district attorneys will agree to plea bargains that set 2 or 3 year sentences for those very same sexual predators? When the punishment no longer fits the crime, we must work together to strengthen those penalties. I will recommend to my Assembly colleagues that we act early in the next legislative session to crack down even harder on sexual offenders with increased penalties and regulatory requirements. As part of that effort, I will be discussing with our members whether a new law providing for the civil commitment of sex offenders should be enacted. When we act, We will act on this legislation, which will be the product of careful deliberation and thought, not political grandstanding. Let's spend a little less time scoring political points and a lot more time working cooperatively for the benefit of the people of this great state of New York. No discussion of next year would be complete without mentioning reform. Last year, the Assembly majority drove the effort to reform government. Working with the Assembly minority, we initiated the most dramatic rule changes that the body has witnessed in a generation, with bipartisan cooperation in the Assembly. Changes that improved the operation of the People's House of the state legislature. Changes that made our proceedings more open and more accountable. For example, we ended the practice of empty seat voting. We established a vital subcommittee structure to provide members a greater role in researching, analyzing, and debating legislative issues. We instituted additional sessions on Tuesday afternoon in the Assembly for the first time, making 50% more time available for review and debate of legislation as a result of that action. Next year, among the internal reforms, we will provide full 24-hour-a-day statewide coverage of Assembly legislative sessions as well as joint legislative proceedings. Last year, we followed our internal reforms by advancing a comprehensive legislative agenda intended to reform the budgeting process, public authorities, lobbying and procurement lobbying, campaign finance, and judicial selection in the state of New York. By April 1st of this year, we went on to pass the first on-time budget in the state of New York in 21 years. Let me assure you that I am committed, and my colleagues in the Assembly majority are committed to working with the governor, working with our colleagues in the Senate, to perhaps do something unprecedented and pass a second on-time budget for the state of New York this year. I can't speak to the governor's intentions, and I can't speak to the Senate's, but I can tell you this. It is indicative of the health of a democracy when a state constitution provides for a balance of power between the executive and legislative branches in the budget-making process. It's indicative of the health of a democracy when a disagreement as to the interpretation of such constitutional provisions is thoughtfully and carefully reviewed by our state's judicial system. The Court of Appeals decision in the case mentioned by Professor Sandler was a very unhealthy development in the constitutional history of the state of New York. No other top court in the nation, including our own, has ever come close to giving a chief executive, not even the President of the United States, the kind of powers that the decision gave the governor of the state of New York. Never before has any judicial decision empowered any chief executive in this country to hold laws hostage in the budget negotiating process. Pataki versus the Senate and the Assembly, Silver and Bruno, expressly affords a governor the authority to wrap a request for authority to spend money with a circumvention or a temporary repeal of existing state law. The decision obviously didn't preordain an untimely state budget, but that does not make a completely incorrect decision any more correct. Does that mean we're finished with reform? No, absolutely not. We'll reassess our budget reform legislation and move it forward where we can. These are some of the key issues facing the legislature in 2006. There are others, of course, including the issue of eminent domain, casino gambling, transportation. Many of those issues are complex, but none are impossible to resolve so long as we possess the will and the imagination, so long as we recognize that certain issues such as education, health care, and public safety are more than priorities. They are obligations of the government. Hopefully, the era of mistrust and resentment between branches of our state government is coming to an end, and a new era of collegiality will bring us to conclusions in these areas. I am going to stop now and entertain any questions that you may have about anything I said or didn't say this morning. So thank you very much for listening.
Great. Terrific. That was a very interesting and full agenda. As we always do, we have questions and microphones, before we do that, I wanted to acknowledge one of your old colleagues, former Senator Manfred Orenstein, 35 years in the state legislature, who came by. And also my good friend Michael Del Giudice from Con Edison now, but was Chief of Staff to Governor Kerry. And welcome to you. I'm going to do something unusual. I want to ask the first question. Is that okay?
Fine.
The last thing you spoke about was the Silver versus Pataki, and I agree with you. I thought the decision went much too far. But the voters turned down the constitutional amendment, which was proposed. Some thought that the amendment went too far to correct. And I wonder, why do you think the voters turned it down, and what do you think would be a more acceptable constitutional amendment?
Well, I think the constitutional amendment that was proposed in this year's ballot was misunderstood in great detail by editorial boards across this state. The substance of the constitutional amendment, let me compare the budget process in New York. You know, everybody knows New York's budget was late 20 out of the last 21 years. Everybody knows that fact. You don't know that the federal budget's been late 21 out of the last 21 years. Nobody knows that fact, and there's a very important distinction. Congress has the ability to pass a continuing resolution by putting forth a spending plan for the next month, the next 2 months, the next 3 months, whatever they choose, and renewing that. The state legislature does not have a comparable authority. The state of New York is dependent on the governor sending what we call an emergency spending bill to the legislature and saying, this is what I choose to spend money on. I'm going to take a minute or two and just give you some anecdotal details. About 7 or 8 years ago, the governor sent us an emergency bill for the spending of government. And in it, he proposed a new item of spending of about $67 million to fix some ski slopes in the North Country. Part of that was political in nature, knowing that the Assembly would reject that spending and not pass it. But by not doing that, you hold hostages the state workers, all the hospitals that rely on those Medicaid checks, and many of the people who rely on social service payments for their existence. Because when you reject it, you reject all the payments. We rejected it, and eventually the governor took it out and passed it. The following 2 weeks, that was a 2-week emergency bill, the following 2 weeks, the governor tried to show the people in the North Country that we really weren't sincere about it. So we put in a proposed $5 million expenditure to send the Harlem Boys Choir to Israel to perform. figuring the New York State Assembly could not reject this. We have a large Black and Puerto Rican caucus and a large Jewish contingency. How could we possibly reject this in an emergency bill? And we did. We told them, this is an emergency bill, no new spending, continue the operations of government, pay the state workers. The point that I am making is only the governor has the constitutional authority to send the legislature a spending plan on an interim basis that provides for the needs of government as the governor sees fit. What did this constitutional amendment really do? It didn't change the balance of power. What it did was dictate for time immemorial, the statute, the Constitution will dictate what constitutes an emergency spending bill going forward when the legislature and the governor fail to agree. What it does is enact the last expenditures subject to adjustments by an independent budget office that we create, similar to the Congressional Budget Office, that provides an analysis of what's required and what revenue is anticipated. That's all that amendment did, but by the time the press in this state and the editorial boards bothered to try to understand it, they had totally different views. All it did was prescribe what an emergency bill is in statute, that on come the first day of the fiscal year, this is what goes forward. It is similar to school districts around this state. When a budget vote goes down, they have emergency statute in place that describes what a school district can spend going forward while their budget was defeated by the voters. So that's really what it was, and hopefully there are enough pieces of transparency of independent budget office that will come back with a modified version that doesn't require a constitutional amendment, that can be done statutorily, that we can convince some of the opponents of that it's the right thing to do, to have transparent budgeting so that items of expenditure are not shoved to the side, don't get the light of day that the public is entitled to, that has an independent budget office that can opine on what things cost, what anticipated revenue is coming in without a political bent to it. And some of those pieces we will hopefully enact in a bipartisan agreement during the upcoming legislative sessions.
Please state your name and your question, and we'll go from side to side.
My name is Pozar, and I'm from Cameras in the Court. I have a public access television program, and I want to make a few suggestions. One, I think you should suggest to the legislature that in election cases that the cameras be allowed in the court, in election cases. In cases where state or city of government or officials are the defendants, there should be a law mandating that cameras can come in. That's election cases where the city or state officials are defendants. And third, when city agencies themselves are the litigants, like for instance in Silver versus Pataki, there should be a law that where city government are the litigants, cameras can be allowed.
Let me. Those are three good questions. Let me get the reaction, and there's a lot of people standing, so I'd like to keep it moving.
I'm sure I'm going to be shorter than anybody else who speaks. I'm just making suggestions. These people are probably going to pontificate and whatnot. Maybe not. I've been wrong before. We're all human. Fourth, when it comes to the appellate courts, the First Department and so forth, those are courts of record. They have no anybody taking transcripts. There's not even a law against the appellate courts having cameras in the court, and that is the fourth place where there should be a law that there must be, not just left to the discretion, but that there must be, unless they come up with a really good reason why the court itself has to be closed. So I just want to close by saying election issues, mandatory, city government litigants, mandatory, city officials as defendants, mandatory, appellate courts, you can bring it in, mandatory. It's not a matter of discretion, but right in those particular issues. I hope you bring it up, and maybe you can address what I've just said.
Well, let me address it very quickly. I think all defendants are entitled to the same rights in the courtroom as outside, no matter where they work, no matter who they are. Let's be number one on that. I don't oppose cameras in the courtroom. I only insist that there be a fair system that shields jurors, that shields witnesses. Studies have shown that people are reluctant to get involved when they know their face is going to be on television as a witness to a particular incident that might be in a criminal prosecution. We have to deal with that. We have to deal with shielding jurors from the notoriety of being in those cases. There were experiments in New York. They have shown a number of failures in those areas of protecting jurors specifically, where everybody had agreed that that was a worthy cause. I don't think you pick out individual cases and say this yes, this no. That's the discretion that takes place right now. It belongs in the judicial realm as far as the discretionary cases that have been shown so far. If we can establish the system across the board that protects the things that are important to protect, I would agree with you, but I would agree with you across the board. Right now, we have not been able to show that system. Next. This is not a court, sir. But you have your exception.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I promise not to pontificate much. I appreciate your comments about CFE. I hope that the lead plaintiff, Robert Jackson, becomes the next chair of the City Council Education Committee to move that settlement forward. Another big issue, though, is the sunsetting of mayoral control. As you know, we're about halfway through that, but in 2009, what I believe has been an extremely successful experiment with mayoral control of the school system will end, and we need to renew that. So I'm wondering, halfway through this experiment, what your ideas are about mayoral control.
Well, the experiment was a full experiment to 2009, and I don't think in 2005 we can yet define the bottom line, because the bottom line is very clear. Have we improved the reading scores of students in the classroom? Right now, there's an incomplete report. The fourth graders seem to show an improvement. The eighth graders do not. That can be and has been explained by other factors that have nothing to do with mayoral control. For example, the universal pre-K program that was started is in its sixth year. The fourth graders have had the advantage of that. The eighth graders have not. Most educators will tell you that that is the best way for children to achieve their education potential, by starting the education process early. So I think the jury's still out on mayoral control. I think that over the next 2 or 3 years we can hone in on a greater understanding of what impact it's had, and hopefully in 2009 we will renew, modify, or amend that based on what the reporting on a full 7-year experiment actually shows us.
Thank you.
Roger Hers, time, an acronym for To Improve Municipal Efficiency. Please comment on the loss of the small and equitable commuter tax.
I think at this time I would support the reinstatement of the commuter tax if, in fact, it had a real chance of passing the Senate. I think it's incumbent on the mayor to look at his Republican colleagues in the Senate and in the governor's mansion to gain their support, and he would have my support as well.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. My name is Sal Russo, and at the outset, I'd like to thank you for your support and leadership in the many health care issues that are confronting, and difficult health care issues that are confronting the people of the state of New York. But my question is in a different area, Mr. Speaker. Today's New York Times reports that Eliot Spitzer says he would end partisan redistricting if he was elected New York State governor. Could you comment on this statement by Mr. Spitzer?
I'd like to see the details of what his proposal is. We don't have, the City Council has an independent commission. When our system was enacted, it was enacted as an independent commission. There are public members to the Reapportionment Commission. I'd be very interested to see Mr. Spitzer's proposal. We clearly, as we come toward 2012, are looking to enact a system that gives the people assurances that we are acting in an independent fashion. So we're open to any suggestions in the area of reforming that makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. My name is Arthur Leonard. I'm a member of the faculty here at New York Law School. Our northern neighbor, Canada, has afforded the right to marry to same-sex couples for several years now. Our three eastern neighbors, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, all provide legal status for the families of same-sex couples. Vermont and Connecticut through civil union laws passed by the legislature, Massachusetts through a decision of the state Supreme Court. 4 lawsuits are pending in the New York court system now, seeking marriage licenses for same-sex couples. I'm wondering where the Assembly is on this very important issue of public policy, and whether the Assembly might see fit to follow the lead of Connecticut when faced with such a lawsuit of resolving it democratically by elected officials.
I think right now the issue will probably get resolved in the courts before you get a legislative agreement in both houses and with the governor at this time. There's clearly great disparity across the legislature, and right now the resolution clearly looks that the courts will be the first area of definition before there's a resolution in New York State. That is clear.
Morning, Mr. Speaker. Herman Badillo. I wonder to what extent you disagree with Mayor Bloomberg's proposals for Ground Zero, which include housing and hotels and other proposals, and do you think those issues can be resolved without any further change in plans?
Well, let me be as blunt as I can, if I may, on that. You know, it took 4 years and a little prodding to have everybody on the same page. And come last June, the legislature passed the incentive package that was laid out in the quote-unquote Marshall Plan that I advanced. It provided for a rebuilding of Ground Zero. I spoke about the need for the incentives on the site as well as the rest of Lower Manhattan. The mayor and I actually got together, put this forward, and the governor in early September signed the legislation that provided for those incentives that clearly were designed for the commercial rebuilding. Now, ultimately, what happens 5 years from now, I can't prognosticate. I believe it's a great place to live. I believe it's a great place to work. We've had 30,000 additional units of housing added to Lower Manhattan in the last 7 or 8 years. Most of that was conversion of old office buildings that were no longer functional commercially. And if you look around this neighborhood, you will see that happening over and over again. And the school I mentioned was something to catch up with the families that were moving in here and to provide for those families. But the reality is we came together on a plan to commercially reinvigorate Ground Zero. That plan stood for about 6 weeks. And then somehow the message went out, apparently, nah, we really didn't mean it, that we're going to change the plan. How do we hope to tell business this is going to be a viable commercial community when 6 weeks after 4 years in the planning, we begin to send the message, we really didn't mean it, we're changing our mind? All I'm saying is we may be right. Ultimately, it may be the wrong thing that we're designing. All I'm suggesting is we have to give it more than 6 weeks to try and work before we start second-guessing ourselves, before we start sending messages to the rest of the world that, well, maybe you shouldn't come here because we really didn't mean what we said 6 weeks ago. And you got to give it a chance to work before you change the plan. That's my only comment on that. Thank you.
Good morning, Speaker Silva. My name is Joseph Garber. I'm a community activist. In view of your concern about reforming the public authorities of New York State, I'd like to call to your attention not to forget about the New York City Housing Authority, which is codified in McKinney's Law. The New York City Housing Authority, unfortunately, is operating in a vacuum. They don't listen to residents. Okay, they have the audacity to schedule a meeting on Rosh Hashanah. They don't give timely notice to the board meetings. And many times, for me to get something done for a resident, I have to call Deputy Mayor Dennis Walcott. So if by any type of legislation or oversight you can have the specific committee study the New York City Housing Authority, it would be greatly appreciated.
The Housing Authority is one of the public authority, one of hundreds of public authorities in the state. This year we did pass a reform that makes them more accountable. We got together in a coalition with the Comptroller of the State of New York and the Attorney General and passed a bill that for the first time really opens up, makes them much more transparent, makes the governance of them much more transparent, and hopefully it will come down to the bread and butter issues that you're concerned about at the Housing Authority and people are concerned about at the Port Authority, Transit Authority, and all the other authorities around the state.
Thank you.
My name is Irene Van Slyke. I'm a member of Develop Don't Destroy Brooklyn. It seems that the U.S. Supreme Court feels that eminent domain is legitimate for economic development, and I was wondering what your thought was or what might happen on eminent domain.
Well, I think, eminent domain has some legitimate commercial and governmental purposes around the state. We are in the course, you may know, of the Assembly has done a number of public hearings on the issue around the state. I am awaiting the report of the committee that's conducting those reports to see what action, if any, we can do to modify the current eminent domain system that applies in New York. It is obviously one of the issues. I mentioned it as one of the issues going forward. I don't think the issue is framed yet in terms of our public hearing process, and when it is, we will be offering some suggestions in the form of legislation going forward. Thank you.
Mark Crawford Levitt. Incumbency protection and fairness of elections, of course, are major concerns. New York City has public campaign financing. The state doesn't. Many have voiced concern about how it really, in some cases, works to just have public money used when there are no seriously contested elections. What do you feel about moving in a different direction of free public TV time at consistently scheduled intervals before elections as a way to both educate the public and level the playing field at a, shall we say, affordable cost?
Well, let me just point out to you that a long time ago, 1986, I became the chair of the Assembly Elections Law Committee, and for the first time, I sponsored a public campaign finance law for the first time in the state, in New York, and that bill, with modifications for inflation, still is the Assembly position on reforming the system in New York.
Probably at the recommendation of the City Club.
Yes, probably at the recommendation of the City Club, I will say, and a lot of other good government groups as well. Let me just say the suggestion you make doesn't really apply to some of the city legislative races. I mean,
Could.
It's very difficult in a little area that free television time is going to have that impact. It's obviously the mail and the street workers that can campaign, that actually do it. You know, we did this great reform in the city where we send out a booklet of describing all the candidates. I think I can count on the fingers of both hands how many voters make their decision based on reading that book.
Because there's no TV.
I'm not debating it with you. I really think the public system, the public finance system, with safeguards for uncontested elections that wind up spending those resources, is the way to go. And I haven't seen a better system at this point, given what the United States Supreme Court has talked about in terms of limitations in and of itself. I haven't seen a better way to level that playing field at this point.
Thank you.
We're going to stop. I promised we'd stop exactly at 9:30. It is 9:30. I want to thank Speaker Silver for a very stimulating day. Stay right here. It's a big agenda, and I hope you'll come back in a year and report passage of every one of them. As we always do, we like to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of this law school. I'd like to present to Speaker Silver a book by my colleague David Schoenbrod, Saving Our Environment from Washington, How Congress Grabs Power, Shirks Responsibility, and Shortchanges the People. You might find this interesting. Thank you so much. Really.